Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I do see some local press and some press from across the state. I see Joe DeShiel just signed on. Hi, Joe. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. Sounds
Yeah.
like a very interesting discussion.
Oh, it should be great. So again, so just a reminder, so what we're going to do is I will record from this computer. If anybody else needs permission to record, please let me know and I will see if I can do that. Can you put a note in the chat box for reporters who haven't joined yet that they should reach out to you for permission? Yes, I can.
So I'm going to try to record Michelle and see what happens. It says, please request record permission. So
As am I, if that's okay.
Absolutely. I just have to figure out how to give you permission.
yeah, I wish I knew myself.
There's more than one way to do this. Hold on. Okay, so let's see. If I go down the list, thank you, Google. Joe, I'm going to try this with you first. More?
All right, Michelle, I think we need to get started.
Okay. Guys, I'm going to probably have to record here locally and I will send it out to everybody. So if you'll give me your email address in the chat box, we'll make sure and get it from there. This is recording. And so we'll ask at this time that we have club kids only with their videos showing so that when Senator Kaine signs on.
He's on.
And I am on.
Hello, Senator Kaine. How are you?
Great. Good to see you.
You're listed as iPad 6. It didn't say Senator Tim Kaine at the bottom of it. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to.
What an incredible opportunity. We are so grateful for you. We are so grateful for all of our club kids who are participating today as well. I say kids, they're all teenagers, because this is such an important conversation that's going on right now. I do want to take a second and just introduce Senator Kaine to all of our youth who are participating today. Senator Kaine has been a member of the United States Senate since 2013. Prior to becoming a U.S. Senator, he was first elected to office in 1994, serving as a city council member. Good job, Senator Kaine, doing the tough work as city council. And then as mayor of Richmond. He became Lieutenant Governor of Virginia in 2002 and was inaugurated as Virginia's 70th governor in 2006. Before his various public service roles, Senator Kaine worked as a civil rights attorney, and I think that's so important to this conversation today. Senator Kaine's background in civil rights, he's really stood up for folks throughout his lifetime, and so having this conversation today is even more important and pertinent than ever before. He's helped clients who have been denied housing due to their race, disability, or family status. And he has a long history of serving those who need him most, just as we do at Boys and Girls Club. We are grateful to Senator Kaine for taking this time to hear from our youth. And I know that there's a lot on your minds and a lot to talk about. So we look forward to the conversation today. And without further ado, I turn it over to Senator Kaine. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm really happy to be on with both leadership and student leadership and adult leadership from Boys and Girls Clubs around Virginia to have an important topic discussion at a really important time. And I'm going to talk for a few minutes, but what I really want to do is answer your questions and take your advice, because there's a number of items that are kind of on our plate right now in the Senate, and your advice will be helpful. So let me start off by saying I'm a big fan of Boys and Girls Clubs, and my work as a city councilman and mayor. The Richmond Boys and Girls Clubs just do such great work. And, whether I was doing programming with Boys and Girls Clubs, or oftentimes a Boys and Girls Club would be the venue for other people to do programming. Annual dental missions where dentists and dental hygienists would set up at Boys and Girls Clubs to help families that needed it. So it's a wonderful organization nationally, and I certainly appreciate the work that you do. In fact, yesterday I was on a Zoom with the Boys Clubs of Central Virginia celebrating a friend of mine who helped give money to set up a Boys and Girls Club in Scottsville to serve Albemarle, Fluvanna, and Buckingham County kids. So anyway, I'm happy to do that. Second thing I wanted to say just in advance is just express my concern or solidarity or sympathy with everybody on this call, because we're living in really unusual times. And without knowing your situations, I bet everybody on this call is either worried about your health or you're worried about the health of someone you love. Maybe even if you've been completely healthy because of the pandemic, you might not have been able to visit a parent or grandparent. My wife and I have both had coronavirus, and her parents live in nursing homes, and in a nursing home an hour from us. We haven't been able to go in to visit them since early March, which is just unheard of. And so this touches everybody. So everybody on this call probably has an anxiety about health of either your own or somebody you love. You might have an anxiety about your finances. Somebody in your family's lost work. Two of my 3 adult children are laid off their jobs because their jobs are closed. You may have missed a graduation. You know, I've been working with the class of 2020, both high schoolers and college kids. And my graduation days, high school, college, law school, are some of the most memorable in my life. And I would have felt cheated had I missed it. And a lot of people have had to miss graduation. So there's a lot of anxieties. And then you put on top of it the significant and justified unrest that is being expressed right now because of deep worries about racial inequities. People who are dying of COVID are disproportionately minorities. People who are losing their jobs in the economic collapse are disproportionately minorities, young people and women. And with the publicly televised murder of George Floyd, the horrific kind of last straw, society is confronting just a series of these horrible injustices perpetrated against specifically African Americans by police across the country. So it is a time of emotion where people's emotions are raw, and they should be. But at a time like this, hopefully we can learn and grow and improve. And that's why I was glad to have this conversation today. Real quickly, what are we trying to do in the Senate? Beginning in March, from March to late April, we passed 4 sizable pieces of legislation to try to help society deal with the healthcare and economic challenge we're going through. And basically, these pieces of legislation put resources into individuals and families, small businesses, large businesses, state and local governments, and then hospitals, nursing homes, and other healthcare providers. Trillions of dollars to try to help us deal with this challenge. And that's 4 pieces of legislation. So what's going on in the Senate right now is we are trying to figure out what to do about a 5th piece of legislation, which we will likely do. I thought we would do it in June. It's maybe a little more likely we'll get it done in July, but there's still an awful lot of people hurting, And whether it's support for school systems or local governments, or whether it's support for families so they can pay rent or not go hungry or have health care. I mean, there's just so much need right now. Having done 4 big bills, we need to see, okay, is that working? What kind of effect is it having? But we will likely do another sizable piece of legislation to deal with the coronavirus crisis, both the health and economic crisis. The second thing we're grappling with urgently is a sense of what should we do to advance racial justice at a time where we are hearing loud and clear from people that we can't just hear words anymore. We have to see action. 2 things that are going on right now on the Senate floor in the next couple of weeks in that space, and then I'll say a concluding word and opening it up. Next week, we will start on a significant debate, the first during my time in the Senate, 7.5 years, around meaningful reforms of policing. We did a good piece of legislation about sentencing reform about a year ago, but the bigger picture of the entire criminal justice system, and especially police reform, we haven't done for a long time. The good news is both Democrats and Republicans feel a need to address this. And both Democrats and Republicans have introduced preferred legislation. So I'm a co-sponsor of a bill that in the Senate was crafted by Senators Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, and there's a companion bill on the House side that would make a number of reforms to policing, about 15 different reforms, but I'll tell you the four biggest ones. It would be a national ban on chokeholds, a national ban on no-knock warrants, and I'm glad to talk more about this if you have questions, a national ban on racial or religious profiling, and then finally, an adjustment to the liability rules in our court system so that police and police departments would not be shielded from accountability in the event of reckless action that endanger people. Reckless action shouldn't be shielded. People should be held accountable for it. Currently, under a doctrine called the qualified immunity doctrine, reckless behaviors are shielded, and we want to make an adjustment to that. The Republicans also have a proposal on the table. It doesn't include those four items, but it includes some other items that we like. So next week, we're going to start debating in the Senate to see whether we can find some common cause. In the Senate, you need 60 votes to pass legislation. Neither party has 60 senators, so the only way we'll get something done is if there's some element of bipartisanship and common cause on a bill, and we'll start that next week. Another item that is a racial justice item that is much around us in Virginia, and you're seeing communities all over Virginia and all over the South grapple with the future of Confederate monuments or buildings named after Confederates or other sort of memorials or tributes to the Confederacy. And we're doing that in the Senate too. I'm on the Armed Services Committee in the Senate, and we just passed an annual bill called the Defense Authorizing Act, which is on the floor of the Senate and will likely be debated in 2 weeks. And in that act, we included a provision that was supported in a bipartisan way to rename any military installations that are named for folks who fought for the Confederacy. 10 U.S. Army bases in this country are named after Confederate generals, but there's also ships or streets or buildings or barracks on bases that are named after folks who fought with the Confederacy. And we put in an amendment that would say over the course of 3 years, we would have a commission that would recommend new names with community input for those facilities. That is, the president does not like that bill, even though it was supported by Republicans in the Senate. The president is against it. He's threatened to veto it, but we're likely to have that discussion on the floor of the Senate very, very soon. So you might see that happening. It's really important for me to hear from you. I went to one of the rallies in Richmond last week, and I chose to go to one last Saturday that was organized by one high schooler and one middle schooler. And it was largely organized and for students. And even though I've been the mayor and governor and I'm now a senator, and it was in my hometown, I did not ask to speak. I just went to listen, because in some ways, the people we should be listening to the most are young leaders. Their perspectives on these issues sometimes don't get surfaced in ways that they should. And so I'm really happy to be on this call today, and I'm really glad to answer your questions, but also knowing that we have opportunities before us where we're going to be debating criminal justice bills or what we do to respond to coronavirus. Your ideas and recommendations will be helpful to me as we decide what next steps we need to take. And with that, thanks for the opportunity to do this today, and I'm thrilled to open it up and now have a discussion.
Thank you so much, Senator Kaine. So we had a call yesterday with all of our students to talk about the process for today. And as we said yesterday, we know that Senator Kaine appreciates real and lively and unscripted conversation. So I will open it up and say, does anybody have a question they'd like to ask the senator? And we decided we'd go with a visual hand raise. So, all right, Jaden, I see you first. If you can unmute yourself.
And could I just ask, if a student asks this question, just tell me where you're from, and so I can know a little bit about you, please.
Great, thanks, Senator.
Hello. First of all, my name is Jaden Spady. I'm from Woodbridge, Virginia, which is Northern Virginia. I'd like to thank you, first of all, for joining us on this day to discuss these topics, especially on this now recognized holiday of Juneteenth. So I've noticed a few bills have been drafted discussing ending qualified immunity. And you mentioned that you're going to discuss it more next week. But I think that's a huge step in the right direction, personally, for holding more people in positions of power accountable for actions. So I just want to know more details about how this bill is going to really ensure that people are being held accountable on the national level. And like, what have the conversations been like, and what direction do you see it going in?
Jaden, thanks for the question. And I think you understand this probably pretty well based on the question, but just in case for folks on the call, if everybody hasn't followed it so closely. So there is a law that's been on the books since the mid-1800s, that's 42 USC 1983, that basically says you can hold a governmental official liable for violating your civil rights. And you just have to prove that your civil rights were violated. However, over time, courts and some statutes have created a doctrine known as qualified immunity for police and police departments. And the practical effect of it is, even if you show that somebody violated your civil rights, say you were a peaceful protester and fired tear gas at you, well, I have a right to protest, that violates my civil rights. In order to succeed in holding someone accountable, you have to show that their behavior was what's called in law willful, which doesn't just mean that they willfully pulled the trigger when they fired the tear gas, but when they did that, they were thinking in their mind, I want to violate this person's constitutional rights. That's virtually impossible to show. And so if you have a doctrine that is so protective, then virtually all violations of rights end up not being able to be brought forward in court. And then individuals and police departments, shielded from liability, are free to essentially kind of do what they want, knowing that there's not going to be liability. So what we're attempting to do in the bill that the Democrats have introduced is make a slight adjustment, but it would be a very meaningful one in terms of accountability. And that is, you could be held liable not just for willful behavior, but if a jury were to decide that the behavior was reckless, then you could be held liable. Recklessness is a much easier standard for someone to meet than a willfulness standard. And what we've learned, Jaden, I practiced civil rights law for a very long time, and then having been in local government, I've watched, I had a police department in Richmond when I was mayor, had a state police when I was governor. If officers or police departments are worried about liability, they actually curb their behavior. They don't want to face lawsuits and have to pay out money that they'd rather be using for salaries or training. And so if they understand that there will be accountability for reckless behavior, you get a lot less reckless behavior. So that is the core of the proposal in the Democratic bill. Now, the Republican bill that was introduced under the leadership of Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina does not include an adjustment to the qualified immunity doctrine. I think it's really important that we do that. So I don't like that fact about the bill, but I will acknowledge they've put a good faith proposal on the table, the Republicans have, and there's many elements of their bill that I like. I don't think it goes quite far enough, but I hope we might be able to have, kind of a good discussion, hopefully starting in the Judiciary Committee, because I think if you really walk through what the qualified immunity doctrine does, most reasonable people will hear about it and say, well, of course, if somebody's behavior is reckless, they shouldn't be shielded from accountability for that. There should be accountability for it. So I'm hoping that's the way the discussion goes. Thanks, Jaden.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jaden. Dontrell, I saw your hand up next.
What will you
Dontrell, tell the senator where you're from.
Oh, sorry.
You're good.
I'm Dontrell, and I'm from Warrenton, Virginia. I'm
Excellent.
with the Boys and Girls Club of Fauquier.
Great.
I would just like to know, what will you and the Democrats be doing to help the Black community in this trying time?
Well, Dontrell, I tell you, there's no single one thing that will be sufficient. So there's a number of things we need to do. I put out a statement, I think it was 2 Mondays ago, of what I would call kind of a racial justice agenda of bills that I either have already sponsored or am signing on to sponsor, and in some instances that I've drafted myself, that I hope to promote and promote with energy to get them passed. And it kind of fits into some different categories. So in the criminal justice category, we were just talking about one, the Policing Justice Bill of 2020, which contains the provisions we were just discussing. That's one thing in the criminal justice side. On the education side, I just introduced a bill with Congressman Scott, who's a member of the Congressional Black Caucus and is also the chair of the House Education and Labor Committee. It's from Newport News. We introduced a bill called the Relaunching America's Workforce Act, which is about job training, skills training for everybody, but with some particular areas of focus on minority communities. Number 3, I'm going to introduce a bill in about a week dealing with the shocking maternal and infant mortality statistics, especially in the African-American community. African-American women have a maternal mortality, which would mean death anytime during pregnancy or within the year after pregnancy. The maternal mortality rate for African-American women is 3 times that of Caucasian women. And interestingly enough, Hispanic women's rate is much more like Caucasian women than African-American women. And so I have a bill that I'm going to introduce dealing with racial disparities in maternal mortality. I'm a longtime sponsor of a bill to abolish the death penalty at the federal level, which has been used in a racially discriminatory way. And I think we should eliminate that. And I also recently signed on to a bill that Cory Booker put on the table that would establish a commission to look at the idea. It's a controversial idea, but I'm a proud co-sponsor of the bill, to look at a commission to study the idea of reparations to those who have descended from slaves. And the idea from this is, it was the government of the colonies and then the United States, local, state, federal, and the court system that established and then maintained and perpetrated slavery from the 1600s until 1865. But although the institution stopped, the government never was held accountable for what it did for that 250 years. And it never sort of made up to those who had been so burdened by slavery. And so I've signed on to a reparations commission bill that Cory Booker has put together. So these are ideas, but I'll tell you the real test on Trella has to be this. The Senate has gotten to be a place where you can introduce a bill. I can introduce any bill I want, but that doesn't mean it's ever going to get a hearing, get a vote, become law, or help anyone. The Senate is a place where bills get introduced, but too often they don't go anywhere. We just passed a great bill dealing with the outdoors and funding of outdoor areas this week. That's great. But the test of the Senate in this moment in time shouldn't be about the bills we introduce. It should be about the bills that we pass and things that actually do good for people. So I'm hoping this criminal justice reform bill will be a first sign that the Senate can actually get something done and make a difference to try to reduce racial inequities. Thanks, Central.
All right. Tara, I see your hand up next.
Yes. Hi, my name is Tiara. I'm from Newport News, Virginia.
Hey, Tiara.
And my question was, what do you feel can be put in place to help African Americans feel safe when they find themselves in an unexpected encounter with law enforcement?
That is a really good question. I think some of the bill that I was speaking with Jaden about should help with that. So, for example, if police departments know that they will be held accountable for reckless behaviors, I think that will lead them to better behaviors, and that should make people feel safer. But I think there's probably a lot of bridge building that we need to do between police departments and communities. There's a style of policing that's called community policing that was very much in vogue in Richmond when I was on city councilman and mayor. And the theory behind community policing is the closer the relationship between the community and the police, the more there's trust, the safer the community will be. And it takes a lot of training to do that, right? It takes a lot of outreach from police into communities. It takes a lot of listening. And if you just trained once, then you got to do more next year, and you have to always do it. I'm convinced that the community policing model can create trust, so that, you know, when I see the police, my initial reaction is not one of fear, but too many African Americans, if they see police, their initial reaction is one of fear. No regular person, no matter what their skin color, should have the initial reaction of fear if you see a police officer. So I think it's going to take some better laws, but I also think it's going to take a significant commitment to training in the community policing mode. One other thing that we can do that might be helpful is, you know, for those of you in Boys and Girls Club who are kind of starting to think about college, every college is accredited. In fact, if a college loses accreditation, it loses the ability to get federal funding for student aid and things like that. But we don't expect law enforcement agencies to be accredited. Why is that? Why do we expect colleges to be accredited, but not law enforcement agencies? So there are accreditation agencies that can go in and look at police departments and help them do better, but most police departments choose not to participate in accreditation. So that would be an additional thing we could do that I think might help police departments do better. And then there's something that you can do too. So let me give all of you guys advice. This is advice probably for after COVID-19 has passed a little bit. Most police departments allow citizens to do ride-alongs with police officers, where you basically get in a cruiser with a police officer during their shift and you see what a police officer does. I've done that a number of times. In fact, I've done it both in car, but I've also done it with bike patrols in Richmond. It can be helpful for citizens to see the everyday work of police officers, because sometimes we have stereotypes too about what police do and what they don't do. And I have found ride-alongs with police to be actually helpful to educate me. And that's something that in your community, I'm pretty sure Newport News has a police ride-along program. Again, maybe during COVID-19, they might have stopped it, but they'll start it up again. And if they do, I would encourage you to think about doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. I see Tyler with his hand up next.
Hello, my name is Tyler. I'm originally from the Bronx, New York, but now I'm living in Roanoke, Virginia.
Excellent, Tyler.
Thank you. And I wanted to ask you, aside from police, there are other people who need to be held accountable for the unjust treatment of African Americans, because there are judges who are letting these cops who harm or kill people unjustifiably go free, while they be giving other people, usually of color, unreasonable times for little things. So could you tell me if there's anything you plan on doing about that?
And Tyler, could you let your next door neighbor introduce himself too?
My name is Lawrence Moore, and we're from the Boys and Girls Club in Nashville, Virginia.
Excellent, Lawrence. Good to see you. So to Tyler's question about judges, I mean, there are a lot of layers of inequity in the criminal justice system. So as you point out, judges that have different standards, you know, with African Americans or Caucasians, prosecutors who prosecute some cases and then don't prosecute others. Sometimes juries, the juries in a community, if you look at their practices, they don't seem even-handed. And so I think how about sheriffs? Look at who's in jail. You know, most of us kind of in our mind, we think about innocent until proven guilty, but there's a lot of innocent people in jail because they've gotten arrested, but they haven't been convicted yet. But because they're too poor to pay bail, they're forced to stay in jail before they've even been convicted. So that's like, you know, guilty until proven innocent if you have to stay in jail before you've been convicted. So the system, top to bottom, has huge problems for minorities and people of lower means, poor folks. If folks can afford their own attorney, they usually do better. If they don't have the money and get an appointed attorney, usually it's gonna, you know, not be as good for them. So how do we more broadly deal with this criminal justice issue? One of the bills that's on the table that a friend of mine, Gary Peters from Michigan, has sponsored is a bill to look at a broad criminal justice commission. The last one that was done in the United States in the 1960s, it was called the Kerner Commission, and they made a series of recommendations. Police reform, yep, sentencing reform, reforms of prosecutors, reforms of jail. Can we use things other than prison time more effectively to punish people for especially nonviolent offenses or drug offenses? So I think there is a more comprehensive need to look at the system. I'm a co-sponsor of the larger bill, but I guess the way to look at it is last year in the Senate, we did a dramatic sentencing reform bill that reduced sentences for some nonviolent offenses. I'm a co-sponsor, a lead co-sponsor with Bernie Sanders of a bill to completely decriminalize marijuana crimes at the federal level because those statutes have been used in a racially discriminatory way. And I would also support the broader commission idea because you're right, there's much more than just policing activities that we have to tackle. And then look, you can go outside the criminal justice area. People get turned away from housing because of the color of their skin. The people who are losing their jobs in the aftermath of COVID, disproportionately, minority women and young. So who's dying of COVID? Disproportionately African Americans, and even more than African Americans, Latinos. So there are these inequities, you know, education, healthcare, criminal justice, housing, employment, you pick any area, we're going to go into it and find that the statistics are nowhere near the same for Caucasians and African Americans. In some of those instances, Hispanics face great discrimination. In a few of the other areas like maternal mortality, they tend to have rates of success similar to whites, but we've got there's a lot of areas we have to tackle.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Tyler.
Asiana, I see your hand up next.
Yes. I would like to say, my name is Asiana and I'm from Waynesboro, Virginia.
Great, Asiana.
I go
Who's
to the
there?
Waynesboro.
I'm Shania Carter from Waynesboro
Shania.
also.
Good.
My question is, how do you feel about the protests and police fighting against them? Not everywhere, but some places that the protesters are peacefully protesting and the police fighting against them while they do nothing.
Sure, no, it's and we've seen it all over the country. Most of the protesters are peaceful, overwhelmingly, not all, but overwhelmingly, they're peaceful protesters who have legitimate concerns. In Washington, D.C., two Mondays ago, a group of peaceful protesters were at Lafayette Square. They were protesting police brutality. They weren't protesting against the president, but by order of the White House, they had tear gas fired at them by federal law enforcement, even though they were not violating a curfew. The curfew was a half hour away from kicking in, so they were completely peaceful, but law enforcement fired tear gas and used violence against them. We need to hold law enforcement accountable for that. Certainly, you know, mayors and people who run police departments or heads of agencies should look at disciplinary action. But if we could make the change that I was mentioning earlier to Jaden and hold people accountable for reckless actions, we would hold them accountable. In Richmond, we have protests every day. And Richmond, we've not had a big history of clashing between citizens and police. But during these protests, we had a similar incident, protests at the Lee Monument. It was before curfew, so nobody was violating the law, being out there doing it. A police officer and the police chief admitted it was a mistake, fired tear gas at peaceful protesters. The police chief lost his job over that. He was fired by the mayor 2 days ago and a new police chief was put in. I will say, because I've worked so closely with police as a mayor and governor, I have respect for the job that they do. They have a very hard job. One of the most common things that a police officer does, if you do a ride along, is respond to domestic violence calls. And that's one of the most dangerous things a police officer does too. And so we have to, you know, recognize a lot of good is done, but then hold people accountable when they engage in violence against peaceful protesters. We have to, please.
Oh, and also, as you talk about the ride-alongs, do you think that people of different colors would be comfortable riding with a police officer that we don't trust in the first place because of these situations?
I think I can imagine that, you know, it was a little different for me the first time I did a riding along with a police officer, because I don't have the fear of police officers, so I did. It would be different for you to do it, but no police department is going to have a ride along program and not try to do it well. And I think the thing for me about the first time I did a ride along was I learned that the normal 8-hour shift of what a police officer does was probably a lot different than what I thought it would be. So I thought it might be responding to, you know, breaking and entering calls or burglaries or things like that. And there was a little bit of that, but it was more of it was responding to, you know, somebody calling and saying, I think my brother-in-law has overdosed on drugs. Can you come and help? Or domestic violence calls. And so the kinds of things that police officers do during a shift were different than what my stereotype was. And that was helpful. And the good thing is, you know, between calls, you're responding to a call. Okay, then that call's over. Then you're in the car driving around. You talk about, hey, why did you do that at this last one? Or, you know, how often does that happen? And it actually really helped me have a better understanding, I think. And so if your community has a ride-along program, I think you can trust that they know how to do it and do it right. And I suspect that anybody could do it and actually, you know, learn some things.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. Yep.
All right. Here, I saw Justice's hand up next.
Hi, my name is Justice Hood. I'm in Spotsylvania, Virginia, so
Hey,
I'm in the Rappahannock region. So I want to say this, that the biggest thing that needs to change is the mindset, because the mindset has been set in and engraved since 400 years ago. So what I want to do is, like, what can you do to help me bring Black youth and law enforcement together in a positive manner to give them both the opportunity to start seeing each other as humans, and so that maybe we can stop this needless hate and violence, because that's one of my missions, because I have a foundation. That's one of my 3 goals, I guess you could say. That's the main foundation of it, is to resolve societal race-based tensions between law enforcement and minorities. So I was just trying to get your perspective on what you would do and how you would try to bring forth this change for Black youth.
Well, Justice, I'm glad to hear about your foundation, and I'm glad to hear about the mission that you have in it, and it's a big topic. I mean, I'll start with your observation and then answer your question. Your observation is the need is to change a mindset, and that's true. I made a bunch of people really mad this week because I gave a speech on the Senate floor about the criminal justice bill. And in talking about our racial history in this country, I reminded folks that the first Africans who came into the English colonies that became the United States came to Virginia, Point Comfort, in 1619. And they were slaves who had been captured in Angola by Portuguese slave traders. And so as soon as they were ripped away from everything they knew, they were slaves because they were torn away. But when they landed in the colonies, at that time in England and in the English colonies, there was no law that said a person could be turned into a slave. And so I pointed out, I said, the United States, we didn't inherit slavery from anybody. There was no rule that said we had to have it. We created it. We created it in the English colonies and then in the country. Then we perfected it. And then eventually we destroyed it, even if we haven't undone its consequences. Well, when I said we didn't inherit it, we created it, I mean, some people really didn't like that. The right-wing folks kind of went off because they don't like to acknowledge the truth of the fact that the Civil War was about slavery, or the U.S., we could have chosen to be like other nations that didn't have slavery. Instead, we made the choice, and it wasn't forced upon us. We made the choice to basically enshrine slavery between about 1619 and 1660.
The uncomfortable.
It's an uncomfortable truth, but you know, if it's uncomfortable for whites to grapple with it, hey, it's more uncomfortable for African Americans to grapple with 400 years of my family being split up and not being able to amass wealth and things like that. So we ought to be able to face some uncomfortable truths too. But there is a mindset. I just noticed that how quickly people got all rattled by what I said. It shows that there's still a mindset out there that is unwilling to maybe put yourself in another person's shoes or hear their experience. So what might you do with minority youth and law enforcement to start, as you say, we got to see each other as human beings. We got to bring down the tension. I would say my experience has been there's sort of two pieces to this. I think explicit dialogue, let's get to know you and you get to know me. So for example, if you have an organization of minority youth, and if you're in Spotsylvania, you're near Fredericksburg, maybe Fredericksburg has a ride-along program, and maybe you could see whether a group of your young friends in your organization, if you could do that over the course of a month, try to sign up and do it, and then maybe have a session where you invite the officers that you rode along with to sit down and, hey, let's talk about what we've learned. And you can ask the officers questions, but the officers might want to ask you questions. Well, what did you see that surprised you? Or did you see anything that you would have done differently? I think that kind of dialogue helps. But the other thing that I have found to be helpful, it's not just talking about race in a candid way that can break down barriers. It's also working together. What is a project that maybe young people and some officers could do in the community together that you both think would make Spotsylvania or the Fredericksburg area better? Is there a project that you could, work side by side, volunteering to be mentors at the Boys and Girls Club after school with elementary students or something like that? I think taking on projects where we work side by side with people is also a really helpful way to see the humanity in each other and, break down barriers, because what you always learn when you do something like that is, well, there's some things, we're different in some ways, but we're alike in more ways than we are different. And working side by side on a project has a way of I think, helping us realize that.
Thank you.
I appreciate it, Justice. Good luck.
All right, I saw Tale's hand up next, and then Elijah. I know you've been raising your hand electronically as well. I just saw that. So we'll go Tale and then Elijah.
Start off. Good afternoon, sir. My name
Tale,
is.
speak up a little bit so we can hear you.
Well, to start off, good afternoon, sir. My name is Tale. I'm from Virginia Beach, Virginia.
Excellent.
I graduated a few days ago, so I'm pretty stoked about that.
That's fantastic.
Thank you. I wanted to ask do you think the government will actually see this as a time to make a change? Will they see the injustice that's been happening to Blacks over the time? Because these protests some are reckless, but some are also peaceful. And I want to know if you think that truly one day we'll all have equality and see each other as one, as the United States, as it's called, all be united.
Tale, that is a really powerful question. I do think I already see change. I think the peaceful protesters are making change. Today is a state holiday in Virginia, Juneteenth. It wasn't a holiday last year. It's going to be a holiday going forward. Democratic and Republican colleagues of mine in the Senate are introducing a bill to make Juneteenth a national holiday. Democrats and Republicans unified in the Armed Services Committee to say that 10 bases that are named after Confederate generals, those names have to change. So we're already seeing changes that maybe should have happened before, but didn't happen before. The question is, will we stick to it and really do the big things? I think this policing reform change is a big thing. I think names are really important. I think changing a mindset about law enforcement activities is even more important. Will we get that done together? That's a question, a challenge for us. But I think you're going to see a set of changes over the next few months legally, but also changes probably be in the elections in November. Those who formed our Constitution, they weren't perfect. They got a lot wrong, but they did get some things right. And one of the things they got right is they knew voting was important, because voting's in the Constitution: election of a president, election of senators, election representatives, but they also knew voting wasn't enough. And so they put in the First Amendment, you have a right to peacefully assemble. You have a right to petition your government for redress of grievances. If they thought voting and campaigning was all you needed, so if you're unhappy, well, just wait 2 years and go to the ballot box and vote somebody out. They wouldn't have guaranteed you the other rights. So I think it works best if we're engaged in peaceful protest and petitioning, and we're engaged in elections. And I think the combined weight of both of those strategies will produce some changes. The last question you asked, though, you said, will there ever be a day when we can really say completely, look at ourselves in the mirror, look at each other in the eyes? We are in a society where everybody is completely equal. You know, we're imperfect people. We're imperfect people. The way I describe the equality principle, you know, the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal. The way I describe that is it's sort of like a North Star that we've set out for ourselves. Now, if you're a sailor, a lot of sailors know how to steer by the North Star. You never get to the North Star, but you can steer by it and you can direct yourself by it. And if you don't, then you'll get off track. I think the great thing about the equality principle is I think it's like a North Star. We should always be steering by it. Will we ever get to it and be able to say there's no more work to be done? I'm not sure we will, because none of us are perfect. And if individually we're not perfect, then society's not going to be perfect either. You know, if you look at our history, we said we were about equality, but allowed slavery. But then we got to the Civil War and we fought the war, and then we ended slavery. And we said, okay, now we're going to be about equality. But we didn't let women vote. And then 7 years later, we allowed women to vote. And okay, so fine, now we're about equality. And then many years later, we realized, well, wait, schools are still desegregated. Just because we ended slavery, we're still treating African Americans second class. Okay, we should allow integrated education. And in recent years, wait, how come you're discriminated against based on who you love? That, you know, LGBT folks can't have a lifelong relationship with somebody else that's celebrated just like heterosexual folks can. So I think every generation probably has the responsibility to look at that equality North Star and then ask a painful question. Even if we are better than 100 years ago, I mean, there's probably something we're doing where we're really not treating people equally. Is it an immigrant? Is it somebody who has a disability? You know, there's probably something we're doing where we're not treating others equally. And I think we just have to keep asking ourselves that question and challenging ourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Elijah, I saw your hand raised.
Hey. Hello, I'm Elijah Henley. I'm from the County District of Boys Girls Club. And kind of expanding on what the other two said, it's like I kind of feel like it's also about acceptance and like repetition, because it feels like this situation has happened at least 2 or 3 times, because a couple years back that one kid got like shot by a cop or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Trayvon Martin.
Yeah.
And then we had this big movement and it looked like everything was smoothed over.
Yeah.
And then not different people, but the same situation happened again.
Yeah.
Like, do you have any ideas how, like, why aren't they different?
I think that's a really painful question. And I think to back to the previous question, will we make meaningful change? One of the things that I think some of the activists feel bad about is, hey, this has happened before and you didn't change. It happened before and we protested for a while and people said things are going to be different and then they weren't. And it keeps happening. And so I think there's some legitimate skepticism about whether we'll make change this time when we didn't before. I'll be candid with you guys about my family. I have 3 adult children. One lives in Minneapolis where the George Floyd protests are. He lives 2 blocks from the street where the protests have been taking place. He's lived in the Twin Cities area for about 10 years, and he was involved in protests when Philando Castile was killed, and he was involved in protests when Jamar Clark was killed. And so his attitude is, well, Dad, I mean, this keeps happening, and everybody says there's going to be a change, but then it happens again. So I think the burden is on those of us in leadership positions to demonstrate by passing criminal justice reform and and other reforms to show that we're not just about words, we're about actions. But I also think people who are activists who are engaging in peaceful protest got to keep the pressure on. The pressure is on, changes are being made, but if the pressure goes off, then there's a million other issues we could turn our attention to. Obviously, we've got the coronavirus crisis and we've got economic challenges, but a common root to all of them is that minorities are affected harder than anybody else, and particularly African Americans. So I'd say activists got to keep the pressure on. And those of us who are in office, we also have to not divert our attention away from these fundamental challenges, but it's a really good question.
Thank you.
You bet.
Shania, and then Muncie will go next.
Hello. So my question is not only how do we help our communities to work together, but people of other ethnicities and races to work with the police? Because not only African Americans have a problem, but other people like Muslim and some Caucasian people do have a problem with the police because maybe they were raised in the hood, as people want to say, and they were just raised around violence. How do we help them work together with the police to just feel safer?
Well, and let me give you another example. It's a really important one. So many Latinos, about 11 million people live in this country who are not documented. They're entitled to be safe, but if they're worried, wait, if I call the police to report a crime, but then the police comes and then they turn me in for an immigrant, because of my immigration status, I can't ever call the police. And so you've got a whole group of millions of Americans who are nervous about ever calling the police because they're worried, that they're going to get turned in because of their immigration status or something. Even though police generally don't do that, there's a lot of fear that that's what they would do. And so then you have communities that won't even call the police, and then they're more at risk. So this is not an issue that is unique to African American communities. And some of it just goes into what is the training, what are the standards that we expect when we hire police officers? What is the training that they get? Do we hire police forces that are diverse? One of the ways to make Muslims feel more comfortable with the police, or African Americans or Latinos, is if they see police officers who look like them. If you don't see police officers who look like you, then you're entitled to, you're going to be a little more worried about what their motivations are. So I think the recruitment of diverse police forces and training and accreditation standards, those are all, really important things that we have to grapple with. The bill that we're introducing, or that Senators Booker and Harris have introduced that I'm co-sponsoring, not only bans racial profiling, it also bans religious profiling, because yes, Muslim Americans or Sikh Americans, if you've ever seen somebody with a long beard and a turban, that's a Sikh, which was a religion that grew out of Hinduism. And a lot of times Sikhs are mistaken for Muslims and then are discriminated against because, oh, that person's probably a Muslim, when they're not. So we need to stop profiling of all kinds. But you're right, this is a bigger conversation than just African American communities, although I think the most extreme examples of misconduct, sadly, have been perpetrated again and again against African Americans. That seems to be the one that no matter how many times it happens and how many times we say we're going to do something about it, we haven't yet really solved it. We haven't.
Thank you.
You bet.
Great. Muncie, I believe you were next.
Yes. So hi, my name is Monse. I'm with the Boys and Girls Club of Central Virginia, and I don't wish to take away from the conversations we're having today with recent events, but I would also like to ask a question about a recent event with the blocking of the president's attempt to end DACA.
Yeah.
And I would like to know what further action will or can our state take to ensure that the most equal opportunities for youth like me and have more Hispanic or people of color have representation of people who are empowered that look like me and look like people of color.
Sure, Monse, no, that's a great question. I was so excited yesterday with the Supreme Court ruling. Before I was in the Senate, when I was governor and then chairman of the Democratic Party, I urged President Obama to provide executive action to protect dreamers, and then the parents and family of dreamers, the DACA and DAPA orders. And when President Trump decided to terminate those, I have been involved in endless negotiations with my colleagues in the White House to try to make permanent the protections for dreamers. Bluntly, the president doesn't want to make them permanent. So even when we come up with a proposal that has both Democratic and Republican support, when we go to the White House to explain it to them, the White House says we won't do it. So I don't think we're going to be able to find permanent protection for dreamers until there's a different president. However, the good news was the ruling yesterday said that this president's effort to undo the program was illegal because it was arbitrary and capricious, and that will provide protection for dreamers for some period of time while Congress, hopefully with a new president, because I think it would take a new president to get it done, could find then permanent protection for dreamers. So our goal in Congress is comprehensive immigration reform, but that would include permanent protection for dreamers. You asked the question in an interesting way. What could happen at the state level too? Well, at the state level this year, the legislature with more Latino members, with a Democratic majority, passed the bill to allow dreamers to get in-state tuition. They won't be charged out-of-state tuition. If you can show you've lived here for a while, you're paying taxes, you get treated like an in-state student, which makes higher education more accessible to our dreamers. Second, we also provided that those who were in Virginia without legal documentation could still get an equivalent of a driver's license so that they can work and pay taxes and be safe when they're on the road, because they have to pass a driver's test like everybody else. So we're starting to see some action at the state level, but I think we still need and the court case was great, but we still need Congress to do a comprehensive immigration reform bill that would include protection for dreamers, and I'm strongly in support of that.
Mm-hmm. So I'm in with all the changes happening, and I stand for it. I just really don't want us as a country to go back and forth, like take a step back from all the good happening and never step forward into more of the changes that need occur.
Can I tell you my advice to you then is, I think the only times we ever step back is when people stop being involved. When people will participate involved, we don't step back. I'll give you an example. I was on a national ticket. I was Hillary Clinton's vice presidential nominee in 2016. We got more votes, 66 million to 63 million, but we lost in the Electoral College. But frankly, as I think about that, I don't think about the 63 million who voted against us. I think about the tens and tens of millions of people who were eligible to vote, who were registered to vote, but who chose not to vote. And I think some of the things we're seeing, like a president trying to terminate DACA or even some of the police violence and brutality, is when people don't get involved, we always go backward. When people do get involved, and that includes both voting, but also peaceful protesting and activism, when people get involved, we go forward. And so I think the way to guarantee that we keep going forward is to be involved in your own way. Everybody has different ways to do it, and different thoughts about how to do it. And that's fine, but it's the lack of involvement. And I sometimes have this debate. One of my sons doesn't like politics very much, and he says the problem is politics as usual. And he's got some evidence for his position, but I always say, no, the problem is apathy as usual. Well, the answer is both of those are problems, but I think things go better the more involved people are, and things go worse when they sort of check out and don't take voting or peaceful activism seriously.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Monse.
Guys, we only have 2 minutes left, unfortunately, and now I know all the hands are going up, and I've had a couple of comments in the chat boxes with some other questions that folks wanted to ask. Senator Kaine, I'd like to ask you for some of our other questions that we may not have time for today. Would you be okay if we sent those to you via email?
Absolutely. If any question does not get asked, I can't remember which of my staffers was the contact on this call. It might have been Corinne.
We've got several of your staff who are contacted, so we can get it sent out.
Gwen Mason, Gwen and Mitchell in my Roanoke office might have been the contact, but Corinne and Luli, if you get us any question that didn't get asked, we'll get you an answer.
So Bright, Jack, I think Maria, I know you guys all had your hands up. But guys, what I'd like to do is take a moment just for all of us to thank the Senator for his time today. This is such a busy time, obviously, for the Senator because he's working so hard on our behalf, on behalf of all of the kids at Boys and Girls Club, on behalf of everybody in the state of Virginia, trying to make sure that some of these reforms that you all have just asked such incredibly intelligent questions about actually are seen through to fruition and are in place. So Senator Kaine, thank you for your time today. Thank you for the work that you've done serving the Commonwealth of Virginia for so many years, from the local level now up to the U.S. Senate. And guys, if we can all please give the Senator a round of applause, even though everybody's on mute, I know we can all see it.
Well, I will just say that if I had had a press conference today with really tough reporters, their questions wouldn't have been as good as the ones you guys asked. They were very, very good questions. And look, you weren't necessarily making the questions like, here's my advice to you, but by asking questions, you're telling me the issues that matter to you and the kinds of things we need to focus on. And so in many ways, you were not just asking me questions, you're sort of giving me advice and perspective that I need. And look, you'll be able to see in real time. Next week, we're going to start having a debate about criminal justice reform on the floor of the Senate. And the following week, we'll be having a debate about should military bases be named after Confederates. So just watch the news and the newspapers over the coming days, because some of these issues we will be talking about on the floor, and your perspectives will help me do a better job.
Senator Kaine, thank you so much. From all of us, Boys and Girls Club across the state and in Washington, D.C., we are so grateful for you and your service. Thank
Glad
you
we could
so much.
take care.
Bye, guys.